the Young Dudes by MsKingBean89, Chapter 132, 7th Year. Victims. Howling. Whining. Scents. Animals. Magic. Mold. He had to get out. Hunt. Pack. Pack. The big one tried to stop him. The black one tackled him. But he had to get out. He was so hungry. So hungry. Remus? Remus, wake up! His eyes snapped open as Sirius shook him roughly by the shoulders. What? Are you okay? He was lying on his back on the dusty shack floor. He was bleeding, but he didn't know where from. Sirius was bleeding too. Remus tried to sit up and winced as his head rattled and his back creaked. What happened? He gasped, throat raw from howling. Or screaming. Here, Sirius helped him up and over to the bed. He pulled out a goblet. Remus didn't know where he'd got it, and whispered, Aquamenti. Sirius's hands were shaking as water poured from his wand, and he handed it to Remus, who drank greedily, spilling it down his front. He knew something was wrong. He could smell the blood and the fear and the sunrise, but it was taking longer than usual for his human thoughts to come back to him, like waking up still drunk with the hangover to boot. What happened? He asked again, frowning. Are you hurt? It's fine, Sirius shook his head. He looked very pale, not his usual aristocratic alabaster, but sickly, worried, yellowish with sweat. You just nipped me a few times. You kept trying to get out. Did I? Remus grabbed him, suddenly, pulling his shirt. Sirius pushed him down, gently, reaching for blankets to cover him with. He shook his head. No, we kept you here. You never left, I promise you. Where are the others? They had to go. Madame Pomfrey will be here soon. When you turned back, it was different. Harder than normal, I think. You wouldn't wake up properly, so James left me the cloak. I didn't want to leave you here. Remus lay back, his mind racing. He tried to remember, but it was all scrambled up. He only knew one thing for sure. Something really bad happened, he whispered. His own voice was trembling now, and a cold dread settled in his stomach like a sickness. Sirius didn't say anything. He just squeezed his hand. He hid under the cloak as soon as Madame Pomfrey arrived, and she hurried in, with a terrible grey look on her own face. He sat up, every muscle screaming at him. Poppy, he rasped. What happened? Please tell me. How are you, first? She asked, coming over to feel his forehead. You're running very high. I feel fine, he lied, batting her hand away impatiently. There was an attack, wasn't there? She nodded, wordlessly. His heart thumped. Who? How many? I don't know, she said, very quietly. He had never heard that voice come out of her before. For a moment, she wouldn't even meet his eyes. She had always looked him in the eye. Please, he said again. She shook her head, very slightly. There's nothing I can tell you. It will be in the morning news. I have to see Dumbledore. He's not here. She stood up. Now, can you walk? Professor McGonagall says you're to go to your lessons as usual, if you're fit enough. We don't want anyone asking where you are. I'll give you something for the pain. They walked through the tunnel in silence, with Sirius behind them, still invisible. Madame Pomfrey dealt with the worst of his scratches, mostly from Padfoot, though fortunately she'd assumed he'd done them to himself, and told him to carry about his day. He took the potion she gave him, but his head still throbbed, and his body ached. As soon as she had turned a corner, Sirius revealed himself, and slid an arm around Remus's back. Why are you pretending you're okay? He hissed, supporting Remus up the stairs back to their dorm. You can barely walk. You'll be fine in a minute, Remus replied, gritting his teeth. She's got enough to worry about. Ugh, fucking stairs. James said he'll send an hour to his dad right away, Sirius said, as they slowly traversed the marble staircase. If anyone knows what's happened, the Potters will. Yeah, Remus nodded, wheezing. Good. But he knew that it was all no good. Whatever had happened, and it had been just as awful as Castor promised. It was the end of any chance of civility for the werewolves. Back in the dorm room, James was still waiting for a reply from his parents. Remus sat down on his bed, heavily, chest even, every part of him aching, his skin on fire. "You could just bunk off," Sirius said, awkwardly, glancing at the others. "We do it all the time." Remus shook his head. He hauled himself up, clutching the bed frame. "Can't risk it. We've got arithmancy first, Snape's and that. If the papers are full of werewolf attacks and I'm not there, what do you want to bet he'll be the first to start stirring? I'm going for a shower. Just a minute." He could hear the other three marauders whispering loudly through the bathroom door, but he hadn't the energy to focus on anything except getting through the next 6 hours. He turned on the taps and let the hissing water drown them out. Werewolf attacks. Magical community demands action. Hundreds were affected by a string of brutal werewolf attacks during last night's full moon, which left 15 wizards dead and at least 5 missing, presumed kidnapped. None of the creatures responsible had been identified as of yet, and the Auror's officers advised everyone to be on high alert and to consult the published ministry guidelines on identifying and approaching werewolves, which are classified as quintuple X and considered highly dangerous. The interim Minister for Magic has been criticised for failure to maintain the werewolf register established by Newt Scamander in 1947. Speaking for the opposition, Abraxas Malfoy released a statement in the early hours of this morning. "Last night's attacks are further proof that the Ministry is in dire need of reform, and on behalf of the ancient and law-abiding families of Great Britain, we demand stricter sanctions on half-humans and other undesirable and potentially dangerous elements." This statement has provoked outrage in what insiders are describing as an increasingly divided ministry. "No names," James muttered darkly. "That's not good." "Protecting the victims' families," Sirius suggested. "Since when has the Daily Prophet cared about that?" Lily hissed venomously. "Since when has the ministry?" "Careful what you say," Peter whispered, eyes wide. "My cousin who works at the Prophet said they're being sent really strict guidelines on what they can write. About the ministry, the war, anything. And there are spies everywhere checking on them, making sure no one's being too critical." This made everyone go quiet, and Lily looked around nervously, glancing over her shoulder. It didn't matter. Everyone in the Great Hall seemed to be talking about the same thing, huddled in groups over newspapers, whispering amongst themselves. "It's not as if we're disagreeing with what the paper says," Marlene whispered, leaning over. "I hate Malfoy's politics as much as the next Half-Blood, but he's right about the failures of the register. The werewolves need to be contained, or stuff like this will happen, Dark Lord or not." "That's ridiculous," Sirius scoffed. "An organised attack like this only happens when there's someone behind it. This would never happen without Voldemort goading them." Everyone winced as he said the name. Remus had noticed that happening more and more as the list of missing grew and people trusted each other less. "They're still dangerous," Marlene replied. "I don't see why we're pretending they aren't. It says right here." She jabbed the black and white print. "Classified quintuple X. I know it's unfortunate for them. They might have been perfectly normal otherwise, but facts are facts." No one said anything to that. Remus was doing his best to ignore all of them. He was busy writing a letter to Professor Ferox, who was the only person he could think of who had been in potential danger last night. Livia knew him. He had attacked her once, and Remus thought she seemed like the sort of person to hold a grudge. Besides, writing gave him something to distract himself from how dreadful he felt, aching and shivery all over. He knew he looked awful too, and thought it best to keep his head down. "She doesn't know what she's talking about," Lily whispered to him, on their way out of the hall. "Miles just sees everything black and white. Don't take it personally." "I don't," Remus replied, tiredly. "I'm fine, don't worry about me." Still, he was dreading care of magical creatures later that morning, when he'd have to sit next to Marlene. He'd cast a glamour to cover up his newest scars, and was sipping on a pepper-up potion, as if it was keeping him alive, but he couldn't hide the fact that he was utterly exhausted, not to mention the bone-crushing guilt he felt over the attacks. He'd known they were going to happen. He'd told Dumbledore, but it hadn't been enough. He ought to have done more. Arithmancy wasn't too bad. He had Sirius, James and Lily in that, and they formed a protective huddle around him, taking their seats in the back of the class. The exercises were almost impossible to do. Remus found his mind oddly fractured, unable to hold down a thought for very long. James and Sirius fell into their usual clownish mischief, creating a satisfactory distraction any time the teacher glanced up at Remus. He was so grateful, especially as they had both been up all night too. Afterwards, Sirius walked him to care of magical creatures, as he had a free hour, and Remus hadn't the energy to refuse. The hallways were too busy for him to risk leaning on the other boy for support, so they just went slowly. "Just bunk off," Sirius pleaded, watching him struggle down the third flight of stairs. "You've shown your face. Snivellus has seen you." Remus just shook his head, carrying on doggedly. As he reached the bottom, a couple of third-year boys rushed past, shouting at each other and laughing. One of them bumped into Remus with his bag, which could have been nothing on a good day, but at that moment was exactly the wrong thing, and knocked Remus sideways into the banister. He bit his lip as the left side of his body hit the hard stone, but he couldn't help letting out a gasp of pain. "Cetus corpus!" Sirius yelled, putting his wand out and firing the hex at all three boys. They yelped as the marble staircases turned to quicksand beneath them and began to swallow them up. Sirius only stopped it when their legs were dangling through the bottom and they were both trapped halfway. "What way you going?" he said, menacingly, before helping Remus down the last few steps. No one intervened. No one ever did when it was Sirius, and Remus was too focused on getting to his lesson on time. "Promise me you'll go back and free them?" he asked as he neared the classroom. "I don't need you getting a detention on top of everything." "If someone else hasn't found them," Sirius shrugged, "I only taught them a lesson. Any prefect would have done the same." Remus usually would have found that funny, but he felt as though he was wading through quicksand too, his limbs heavy and slow, everything around him foggy and blurred. "Right," Sirius was saying, "I'll be back here in an hour to get you." "I don't need collecting. I'm not a child," Remus muttered. "No," Sirius squeezed his hand very quickly. "You're my Mooney." He made a mental note to save that up for later, when he was alone, and can bask in the thought of being serious as anything. Just now, he hated himself too much to allow anyone to be kind. Care magical creatures was worse than he could have imagined. His temperature was running even higher from the exertion, and he had to keep wiping sweat from his eyes, hair sticking to his forehead. Despite breakfast having been only an hour earlier, his stomach felt like an empty cavern, growling intermittently. His head ached and his vision swam, but he sat bolt upright, staring fixedly at the blackboard. They were supposed to be doing dragons, identifying the various species and their individual properties. Kettleburn began the lesson as he always did, with a terrifying and usually harrowing story of an encounter he'd had with whichever creature they were discussing. Today was no different, and the battle-scarred professor was in his element today. He had lost 2 limbs to dragons. Despite this animated tale, only half of the class was actually paying attention. You could tell by the faint look of horror on their faces as they scribbled down notes. The other half, Marlene and Mary included, was busy reading the chapter in their textbooks which concerned werewolves. "There's something a bit sexy about the whole beast man thing, though," Mary whispered across Remus, who began to feel light-headed. "Mary!" Marlene hissed angrily. "That's completely insensitive. People died." "I'm just saying. You wouldn't think that, anyway, if you met a real one. I spoke to Cian Bosch over the summer. She left last year for healer training, and she's been shadowing a healer on the lycanthropy ward at St. Mungo's. They have awful hygiene, most of them, because they can't live near normal wizards, and they basically live off handouts and charity." "Well, then I feel sorry for them," Mary snapped back. "That sounds horrible. Wizards are so heartless." "You're being deliberately dense. They're not safe." "Excuse me, Professor Kettleburn." The whole class turned to see McGonagall standing in the doorway. Remus's stomach dropped. Had she confirmed? Had the ministry finally confirmed? The head of Gryffindor House looked very grave and was holding a letter in her hand, but she did not look at Remus. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Marlene McKinnon, may I speak to you?" Marlene frowned and stood up, setting her quill back into the inkwell. She threw a confused glance back at Mary and Remus before following Professor McGonagall out of the room. The door closed, and everyone stared at it in silence. "She can't be in trouble," Mary whispered to Remus. "She's too goody-goody." Remus mumbled something, but his hunger had turned into queasiness, and he didn't want to open his mouth. He wished he could take off his cloak. The room was so stuffy and hot. He was getting uncomfortably damp under his armpits and across his back. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Mary asked, her face concerned. "You look like you're going to puke. Is it Kettleburn's horrid stories?" Remus nodded, very slightly, shooting pains bursting up his neck as he did so. He rested his forehead in his hands, hoping he just looked like he was really interested in his notes. There was no room for Mary to probe him any more, though. A horrible shriek sounded outside the classroom, followed by a chilling moan of absolute despair. Mary was on her feet at once and flew out of the room to see her friend. Remus caught only a glimpse as the door swung open and shut of Marlene on her knees, sobbing, and McGonagall bent over her, patting her shoulders. Even Kettleburn was rendered mute for a few minutes, before regaining his composure and clearing his throat. "We're living in difficult times," he said, quite out of character. "I urge you all to be kind to each other, especially as you prepare to leave Hogwarts." The lesson continued after that, much subdued, and it took all of Remus's concentration to stay conscious in his seat, now that he was alone at his desk. About 15 minutes before the class was due to end, there was a second knock at the door. "Enter!" Kettlebin barked. The door opened and Lily walked in. "Good morning, Professor. I've just come to collect Marlene's things for her." Kettlebin nodded and gestured at Marlene's desk, where her work was still spread out, a book bag hanging off the back of a chair. Lily went over and quickly started gathering things together. She took one look at Remus and raised her hand. "Sorry, Professor. Could I ask Remus to come with me? I didn't realise Mary left all of her bits too." Of course, Kettlebin nodded, distractedly, labelling a diagram of a dragon's lair on the board. "Chapters 18 to 25 for next lesson, please, Mr. Lupin." "Yes, sir," Remus croaked, picking up Mary's bag. Thank God it wasn't heavy. And thank God for Lily Evans. As soon as they were outside in the corridor, Remus leaned heavily against the wall and closed his eyes. "Oh, Remus," Lily said, anxiously, raising a cool hand to his forehead. "You look dreadful." "I'm fine," he mumbled, uselessly, eyes still shut. "Just give me a second. Is Marlene—" "She's gone home," Lily lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. "Her brother, Danny, was attacked last night. St. Mungo started releasing names." Remus's head swam. He opened his eyes only to see black spots, and closed them again, in case he fainted. "Is he—" "He's alive, but it doesn't sound very good." The guilt was overwhelming, roaring in Remus's ears. How would he ever look Marlene in the eye again? "Come on," Lily took his arm and draped it over her shoulders. She fit very snugly, but he didn't dare lean on her too much. "I'm taking you to the tower. You're in no state for school. I'll say you're helping me pack for Marlene." "Someone ought to tell—" He was about to say Yasmin, but realised that it was still a secret. "Madam Humphrey," he finished, lamely. "Marlene's going to miss healing lessons." "I'm sure she already knows," Lily replied, briskly. "Come along now." She was a lot harder to refuse than Sirius.